Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of this class. I want to repeat what I said last week that I am extremely impressed with the quality of your focus questions and discussion board posts so far, so keep it up. For this week, we'll be dealing with immigration in the period from 1865 to 1924. This isn't the last time we'll deal with immigration in our country in this course, and it's going to be one of the threads that we re-examine throughout the semester. There will be some common themes: fears that immigrants don't share American values, that they compete for jobs, weaken our economies, versus many other periods, like the one we're dealing with in this week's lecture, where immigrants were seen or at least tolerated as an opportunity for economic growth. So this week I want to examine some of the factors leading to the greatest era of mass immigration in our country between 1865 and 1924, during a time when we had almost completely open borders. I can switch here. Oh, I'm not Adam Smith. So, that's a good spot for me. So before we get into immigration, I think it would be useful to have a little discussion on what liberalism means. So spoiler alert, we don't use the word the same way today as it was used 200 years ago. Liberalism started as an Enlightenment idea with a lot of influence from British and French thinkers, like the fellow I have pictured here. Though with time, its ideas and influences would become global. So the Enlightenment itself was all about using rational thought and science to make life better. People like John Locke in the late 1600s began to argue that government should exist as a sort of social contract where people only give up their absolute freedom in exchange for a social undertaking that would improve the lives of everyone. It was Locke who argued government should protect life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson would switch out property for the pursuit of happiness in the American Declaration of Independence, which would become another foundational global document in liberalism. So when we use the word liberal today in our country, we're typically referring to the policies of the Democratic Party or parties that advocate similar, perhaps more extreme policies than Democrats. Conservative, then, is typically something we construct to be the opposite of liberal. So, over 250 years of our history and world history, though, conservative and liberal have meant very different things. So, today, we often think of conservative as referring uh, to those who are pro-business and want minimal government regulations over business. Conservatives are those who believe markets are better solutions to our problems than government, and typically oppose what they refer to as entitlement programs like public assistance. In the early years of the American Republic, it was liberals who were far more pro-business, and liberals were the ones who wanted minimal government interference in our lives. Conservatives in England in particular were the ones who were in favor of poor relief money, in part because they hoped such relief would prop up their aristocratic feudal systems and fend off revolutions. Liberals believed freedom of contract and labor were solutions to poverty, not charity. So the big shifts in how liberal and conservative essentially became opposites of what they once were occurred in fits and starts between, I'll date it to between the end of the Civil War and the Great Society reforms of Lyndon B. Johnson 100 years later. That's where you really see our more modern ideas of liberalism as being crystallized in our country. So this transformation wasn't just occurring within the borders of the United States, though. Again, these are transnational changes. So I want to introduce a key liberal thinker and tie some of his ideas to immigration. You've got Adam Smith here, and we'll refer back to him throughout the semester. We remember Smith as an economist today, the father of capitalism, he's sometimes called, which means those who worry about capitalism's excesses might not see him in the most favorable light. Smith himself, though, never used the term economist. It wasn't around yet. He instead called himself a moral philosopher. Smith believed that if people could be in charge of their own affairs, that they would make decisions that would benefit society as a whole. As a classical liberal, and I've got an example of it here with the butcher, brewer, and baker, but as a classical liberal, he felt the government needed to allow for total freedom for an invisible hand then to regulate economies. Then, if people worked according to their own interests, forces like competition would encourage people to provide the best products at the lowest prices. In this equation, there was no room for monopolies like the big mercantilist companies of his day, and absolutely no room for slavery. Slavery wasn't just bad for slaves, it was bad for everyone because it caused unfair competition with free laborers, took consumers out of the economy, and most importantly, took intelligent people out of society with all of their potential innovations that could have benefited everyone. So capital and trade should be free, governed by an invisible hand for Smith, and by default, this implies people should also have rights to freely move for labor. National borders only hamper the optimal growth of prosperity. That's the core of liberalism. When people have personal liberties, it's better not just for the individuals, but for society as a whole. That's why he called himself a moral philosopher. His most prominent work, The Wealth of Nations, came out in 1776. He was also a supporter of the Americans' desire for representation in Parliament. So conservatives then, they emerged in opposition to liberalism. They worried that societies like industrializing England were undermining noble privilege and the proper order of society. They often looked back fondly on feudal era Europe as a time when things were ordered, people knew their place, and the only people to engage in enterprise were those with permission of the ruler, typically those with noble blood. Adam Smith argued that ability mattered, not nobility. He felt the world would be best ordered if we had free trade, uninhibited by barriers like tariffs. So, in the aftermath of, where do I put my, I'll be right there by Emma Lazarus. So, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States entered into its second era of industrialization. There was virtually unrestricted immigration. Chinese people were the first to be forbidden to immigrate, and at points of entry, immigrants were checked for infectious diseases and either quarantined or denied entry. Later, radicals and anarchists were attempted to be screened out, as were polygamists, which was meant to stop Mormon immigration at a time when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints still practiced polygamy in violation of federal law. So, like I say, virtually unrestricted immigration. The dominant pro business ideologies of the time recognized that people were a resource. The US was consuming the massive lands of the West and needed people to populate them and make the country prosper. It was also a period of exponential economic growth. America went from being a mid level power to a superpower during this period of explosive immigration. And I shouldn't, it certainly wasn't straight up economic growth. There were very serious recessions and depressions that were global in this period. But anyways, within my lifetime too, both Republicans and Democrats were generally in favor of limited immigration restrictions. Both parties very recently favored globalization as a means to achieve economic growth and believed that freeing the flow of both capital and people across borders led to maximum productivity. Starting in the 1980s, Republicans at the state level in places like California began to appeal to older nativist sentiments, though many within the party resisted. So under George W. Bush, ICE was established as a branch of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Their initial task was to assist with customs and assist with immigration enforcement, which was odd at the time because those agencies already existed. ICE then, as an agency, grew exponentially under Obama. The 2016 election was a turning point, with Donald Trump dismantling the asylum system as it existed, hampering immigration judges, and making it almost impossible to legally immigrate to this country, while using policies like family separation as a form of terror to try to deter undocumented immigrants. ICE's mandate to hunt down undocumented immigrants has also expanded under President Donald Trump, but I want to be clear that it expanded greatly under President Obama as well. So we've had extreme anti-immigrant sentiments in our country before. By contrast, when we have had generally open immigration policies, it is typically because both major political parties value the economic boom that always accompanies immigration. So, in short, the greatest resource the United States has ever had is people. It's people. So, I've got a focus question that asks you to think about why people immigrated. Thinking about push and pull factors offers a rather straightforward way to conceptualize the unprecedented levels of global immigration that occurred during the 19th century. In the 1800s, the dislocations of modern life, that there's a theory of modernity that argues that the world after 1789 was fundamentally different than the world before it, that institutions of mass mobilization, technologies, and global markets emerged to change the way life would be forever. But so the disruptions of modern life then caused more people to leave their homes than ever before in history. Millions traveled within Europe, Asia, and Africa, and millions more traveled to settler colonies like Argentina, Brazil, Algeria, South Africa, Canada, and of course, the United States of America. The USA would become the single most important destination for immigrants in the 19th century. Immigrants made us who we are. They created the fabric, vibrancy, and strength of America, but they were in most cases not welcomed with open arms. There were, of course, exceptions. Protestant immigrants from England have, for the most part, been accepted throughout American history. And everyone's been accepted by at least someone in our history. Irish Catholics, here we go, were myself too close to Queen Victoria there. So Irish Catholic immigrants were among the first group to face the scorn of those who felt that immigrants were a threat to the very fabric of America. Many of the founders of English colonies were steeped in the extreme anti-Catholic vision of Puritan English Protestantism. By the 1600s, this Protestantism dovetailed with centuries old English persecution of Irish Catholics, which reached genocidal proportions during the English Civil War under Oliver Cromwell. Those Irish who came in the early 19th century faced a well developed anti Irish and anti Catholic level of discrimination, much the way Middle Easterners and Muslims face discrimination today. By the 1840s, there was a significant uptick in immigration from Ireland after a completely unnecessary famine that underscored the stupidity of illiberal laws in Great Britain. In 1856, there was a blight that harmed much of Ireland's potato crop. That shouldn't have been a big deal. Blights are common, as are droughts, diseases, and numerous other factors that harm agricultural productivity. When there's a drought in Kansas today, for example, you see virtually no difference in the price you pay in the store for bread, because we live in a large, globally connected modern economy that can work around these kinds of things. So those distribution systems have done a great job even through the COVID-19 crisis. I'm sure many of you or your loved ones are probably part of those systems, so thank you. But one of the problems in Ireland, though, was that the majority of the population were peasants who did not have access to land except for the smallest of plots. On these plots, they naturally grew the most productive crop in calories per acre in the world, which is potatoes. So when the potatoes went bad, 1.5 million people starved to death and another 2.5 million people emigrated. So just to put that into perspective, that is half of the population of Ireland. Half of the population of Ireland was gone within a decade. So throughout the famine, Ireland continued to export wheat and beef. The wealthy classes just didn't think that that should go towards feeding the starving. This led to liberal reforms in England to allowing England to freely import American grain rather than artificially protect their own landowners who couldn't compete with American exports. So these landowners were the same people who were willing to starve the Irish to death to keep their profits up. So I just want to be clear, the lack of functioning markets and the lack of free access to markets, as well as just the completely disproportionate greed of an English aristocracy in Ireland, is what caused the famine. It was not the potato crop going bad. That's just a normal event of nature that should have been worked around. So let me skip ahead here. Where do I put myself? I'll put myself right in the middle of these celebrating people in this pro-immigration poster. So the world of the early 1800s was one that had become more globally connected than ever before. After Napoleon's defeat, revolutions continued to simmer across Europe, Asia, and Africa. In 1848 in particular, Italians, Slavs, Arabs, Turks, Germans, Scandinavians, and French people revolted. Many were suffering economic pressures from competing with American wheat being grown in places like upstate New York, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest, that was delivered along canals and railways and shipped to Europe, where it usually sold cheaper than locally produced wheat. These people had economic difficulties, but also wanted the protections of liberalism. They wanted the constitutionalism that American democracy promised. America, with its booming economies, booming in part for undermining local economies, as well as promise of greater freedom, was a natural draw. Scandinavians and Germans flocked to America after 1848 and continued to come well into the 20th century. My Norwegian grandma was born in the U.S. about a year after her parents immigrated here in 1907. Germans also came from a hodgepodge of small German-speaking states in Central Europe. There would be no unified Germany until 1870. Germans also came well into the 20th century. My German or Austrian grandpa immigrated in the mid-1920s and was eventually deported for overstaying his visa. Many Germans settled largely in the Midwest, which is where my family ended up as well. These were largely liberal, sometimes radical-leaning people who often had resources to spend, unlike Irish people who came with virtually nothing. Italians and Slavs would come more at the end of the century, but some were beginning to trickle in, as were some Arabs and Turks, as well as Russian Jews, who had come in massive ways to escape murderous persecution in the Russian Empire. The main point, though, is that it was all interconnected. American economic growth couldn't happen without people, and these people wouldn't have wanted to come if American economic productivity and ideas weren't disrupting their lives as they previously existed. But throughout our history, there have been, here, put myself right at the bottom of this French beer, Gavroche, who didn't see the big picture, who saw immigrants as threatening and problematic, not a source of opportunity, growth, and ultimately strength. The German immigrants I mentioned before are really the reason so many Americans drink beer today. Before the 1840s, Americans drank hard cider, whiskey, and ale. Beer was an immigrant thing. During World War I in particular, beer became unpatriotic for its association with Germans. I just have a picture here of a French beer because it, in the United States, none of our major beer breweries or anything have anything but German names. Just think of every macro brewery and you'll notice that every single one of them is a German name. So the temperance movement, ironically, had a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric built in, i.e., alcohol breaks up families, sure, ruins societies, and sort of the subtext is makes you like the Germans and Irish. So in 1849, a group formed in New York City called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Their main focus was to prevent more immigration. When asked about their order, they were told to reply, "I know nothing," which was a fitting way to, describe xenophobia. In the 1850s, they made up 40% of Pennsylvania's state legislature, a state built by immigrants that unfortunately has a history of keeping different ethnic groups divided. So, in his global assessment of immigration that I'm having you read for this week, Osterhammel also deals quite a bit with China. The 19th century was an all around terrible century for so many Chinese people. In the 1830s, they first went to war with the East India Company, and by default, Great Britain, in what was called the Opium War. This was basically a fight against drug dealers who wanted to dump opium grown in India onto the Chinese to have excess funds to use for tea, for which there was an exploding market in other parts of the British Empire. The Chinese lost, after which the Qing dynasty quickly imploded on itself, with lots of meddling by British forces and even some American volunteers. This horrifying conflict was called the Taiping Rebellion, and in the disease, starvation, and murderous campaigns it entailed, somewhere between 20 and 50 million Chinese people perished. An estimate that I see very frequently is 30 million. It is by far the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century and on par with the world wars of the next century in its death toll. Like with any conflict, there were also millions of refugees. Many of these people were exploited through a contract labor system that sent them all over the world. They were known rather derogatively as coolies. The California Gold Rush of 1849 attracted many Chinese people to the United States as free laborers. They mined, though were pushed out of mining by discriminatory foreign miners' taxes. So they did other things like run laundries and supply miners. Many were indispensable to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I mentioned earlier that the overall arc of economic growth during the 19th century was upwards, but that doesn't mean that there weren't usual downturns in the business cycle. When these happened in the West, they were particularly depressing, and especially because the West was very much a commodity production economy. So Chinese people were inevitably blamed for their competition for jobs with other Americans. A series of state-level, then federal acts culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that banned all Chinese people from immigrating to the U.S. 7 years earlier, Chinese women had been banned, with the assumption that they won't then reproduce. So, anti Chinese racism was part of the 19th century yellow peril fear, where Westerners genuinely feared that they would somehow be destroyed if they were to give equal rights to East Asian people. What's sad is that U.S. businesses benefited from the trade of the East India Company that destroyed China. Then U.S. politicians refused to allow refuge to the people whose country they had been complicit in the destruction of. This pattern will unfortunately repeat many times in the 20th century and 21st centuries, especially with U.S. destabilization of Latin American countries, then demonization of their refugees who seek to immigrate here. So at the same time that, trying to flip slides here, come on. Here, I'll be up on these people's roof. So at the same time that early efforts are being debated to keep out Chinese people, one of the greatest accomplishments of the American Free Soil campaign occurred, which is the Homestead Act. One political party that formed as the West was being annexed, especially from Mexico, was the Free Soil Party, which advocated the abolition of slavery so that so that American land could be open to small private family farms. They reasoned that slavery sucked away the opportunity for everyone. One of the things they also advocated was giving the land in the West away to anyone who could farm it, use it productively. Their advocacy helped to make this idea more mainstream to the point that the Republican Party accepted the plan. The eventual Homestead Act of 1866 would give a quarter section, meaning 1/4 of a square mile or 160 acres, to anyone who could pay a nominal clerk's fee and farm the land for 5 years. This act led to an incredible period of economic growth. So America's first industrial revolution centered around textiles. I'll be right underneath the Bethlehem Steelworks. The second, though, centered around heavy manufacturing, especially for farm implements. This second revolution wouldn't have happened without demand coming from the western frontier. As it turns out, farming 160 acres without machines is pretty hard. So, as American steel mills and foundries rose to the challenge of equipping a nation of farmers, you had rapid economic growth that served as the single biggest pull factor inviting immigrants to America. Recruiters for large new factories like the McCormick or John Deere companies, centered in the Midwest, would tour Europe and the Ottoman Empire seeking workers, promising streets paved in gold. By the end of the 19th century, American factories, transportation infrastructure, and enterprising farmers and made America into one of the largest economies in the world. This is also a fascinating period for agricultural inventions. Virtually every modern tillage, haymaking, and harvesting piece of equipment you can imagine was pioneered in the 19th century. And there are 19th century versions of these machines that are so cool to look at. So all of this, land, immigrants, innovation, made this possible. Uh, and we're going to deal with the dark side of it next week because this land wasn't empty. There were people there. But in this picture, you see the Bethlehem Steel Mill of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It is a casino today. So with this slide, then, I want to jump ahead a bit chronologically. Man, I don't want to have anything to do with this picture. Kind of makes my blood boil. I'll just be underneath it. So with this slide, we're skipping ahead a bit. That incredible era of free and open immigration came to a crashing halt in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that restricted immigration to 2% of the population of any nationality's number of immigrants that were in the country in 1890. There had been some earlier restrictions as a security measure during World War I and as part of the global Red Scare of 1919. A couple years after 1924, immigration quotas were reduced to 150,000 people per year total. Asians were completely barred, and 85% of immigrants had to be from Northwestern Europe or have a college degree or skilled trade. I mentioned earlier, I have grandparents who immigrated just before and during this era. My wife does as well. My wife's grandpa was from England and became a legal citizen immediately when he immigrated in the early 1920s. Mine was from Austria and spent about 20 years as an undocumented alien. He was deported during the 1940s to Mexico, but walked home as his family lived on the Arizona border at the time. So, very, very different experiences. This act, the Johnson-Reed Act, would be slightly revised after World War II to allow displaced persons to immigrate, and it would be slightly modified in the 50s, but it wasn't until the 1960s that its reversal began. Earlier, I mentioned that there had been periods of consensus that immigrants are good. One of the reasons that this act passed was that there was consensus that they posed a threat. One of the lone voices to speak out against this act at the time was Charles Evans Hughes, who criticized specifically the barring of Japanese immigrants. Charles Evans Hughes has a plaque on our courthouse square. He studied law at an office here in Delhi, and he taught at Delaware Academy before becoming the Secretary of State and eventually Supreme Court Justice. So apparently we gave him a good understanding of the Constitution here in Delhi. Okay, so that's the end of this week's lecture. I hope thinking about this gives you some context to understanding ongoing debates over immigration today. And as always, go ahead and take a stab at the bonus questions below. Actually, I should record the bonus questions if I'm going to have you do them. All right, there you go. Now you can pause on those, and they're also available on the PowerPoint, which is posted to Vanco Hall.